Let's talk about foreign markets. We're not going to go as in depth as we would obviously in an international business class, but there are a few things I would like you to know. First off, some definitions. Usually, when we talk about foreign markets, people think of international business as international business, but there are actually some definitions that are very specific, and you need to know what those definitions are, even though we'll probably continue to just call these international businesses, and most people do, and that's okay. First off, we have local business. Local businesses are those that only have a few locations, usually within a state or just a city. For example, in Montana, we have Vons, and they're only in Billings and Bozeman, so they're considered to be a local company. The next designation is domestic. Domestic is a company that has locations all over the country, but only within the country. So, for example, Rent-A-Center has locations all over the United States, but they're only in the United States. Okay, the next designation is international. Basically, they import and export. They have no direct foreign investments. International precious metals is like this. They sell coins and bullion and those kinds of things, but they don't actually have plants that build this stuff or mines that dig it up. They import it or export it to other countries. A multinational company is one that has a direct foreign investment in a limited number of countries. Castle Brands, which sells alcohol, has maybe 30 countries that they work with. Okay, there's like 195 different countries that are recognized in the world. So they have some, but not a massive amount. A global company, on the other hand, has direct foreign investments in a lot of different countries. Boeing has plants or employees located in about 50, 60 different countries. And finally, we have what are called transnational countries, and they have a foreign direct investment in most countries. And the only country that Coca-Cola doesn't service is North Korea, as we heard earlier. Okay, so why would a company want to even go into direct foreign investments? Well, for one thing, you can gain access to new customers. It's a big issue if you want to expand. It's whole new markets that haven't been tapped. Sometimes you can do it to achieve lower costs. This could be done through the differences in exchange rates or in the cost of transportation if you're closer to your market. Sometimes we do it because there are fewer regulations. We don't have to worry so much about environmental issues or whatever the case may be. Sometimes there are favorable tax or labor laws. Sometimes countries will give an international business a tax break to open in their country to help stimulate investment and employment and those kinds of things. Sometimes we do it to capitalize on our core competencies. We do something very, very well, and so we will go into foreign countries to import or export in order to be able to continue doing that. For example, Nike, they import their shoes from Asia, and their core competency is actually marketing. Sometimes we do it to spread risk. If the economy in one country goes bad, then perhaps the sales in another country can help pick that up. So let's say we have a plant in Mexico and we have a plant in Germany. And if Mexico's economy has a problem, or their markets have a problem, then we can count on Germany to help pick up that slack so that we don't just go under because we picked a bad place to go. There's some differences when we deal with markets in foreign countries that we need to deal with. The first one is cultural. Obviously, language is an issue. And one of the things you really need to be careful of when you're dealing with different countries is that you get a native speaker. It's not as good an idea to have somebody whose second language is the language of the country, because there are a lot of nuances that people aren't necessarily taught when they're taught a foreign language in a formal setting. Another issue is social behavior. Um, Another issue is social behavior. How do you greet someone? Do you talk while you eat? Do you bow or shake hands or whatever those social norms are? Okay, work ethic and expectations. Uh, for example, in Japan, they come in early and they stay late, and that's expected of them. In some places, there are siestas. In France, it's only a 32-hour work week. So you have to make sure that you understand what those differences are. Another is pay expectations. In the US, we expect to have overtime, we expect to have holidays off that are paid, we expect some benefits. In other countries, they're lucky to have jobs, and so they don't force overtime issues and they don't get holidays off or any kind of benefits that we think of as benefits. More cultural differences include things like the standards of living. Developed countries have very high standards of living, us, Canada, most of Europe. Um, Developing countries are raising their standards of living, and you need to be aware of what those standards of living are. And then we have third world countries who have very low standards of living. And this all plays into what's considered to be pay expectations and how you can run the business. Issues with ethics are another thing, and we'll deal with ethics very specifically, but the two of the big ones are working conditions, overtime, child labor. And child labor, for example, in some countries, child labor is acceptable, in other countries, it isn't. In some countries, overtime pay is expected, and in other countries, they don't really know what that means. And working conditions, for example, and we have things like OSHA and other safety standards, and they don't necessarily have those in all countries. So that's another issue to deal with. And another one is religion. What days off? Um, in the United States, for example, a lot of places expect to have Christmas off. Um, in Israel, they would have days off for the Jewish holidays and so on. And things like prayer times, if you have Muslims, for example, they have to pray more often, and it's part of their religion. You have to take that into account. There are some differences in the markets. For example, product offerings. In the United States, we like supersized everything, and just look at Costco or Sam's Club, and you can see, we always offer like huge packages of paper towels, for example, or 47 boxes of milk or whatever the case may be. But in a lot of countries, they don't have storage space like we have to offer um, huge product sizes, and so things have to be kept smaller. For example, when I went to England the first time, I stayed with my brother, and he had an apartment. It was pretty decent size, but he has this tiny little refrigerator, only hold like 2 or 3 days worth of food. Another issue is quality. Developing countries and developed countries expect higher quality generally than do third world countries who are just happy to have what the product is. Ethnicity is something that has to be considered when you're talking about market differences. For example, color preferences. Um, in the U.S. and many Western countries, um, white is purity and black is for death, whereas in many Asian countries, white is the color of mourning. You don't want to use red and black in combination in Germany because it's um, reminiscent of the Nazi. And advertising styles. For example, many European and Asian countries are much more open about displays of nudity and sexual innuendo than we are here in the US, but we are more liberal than some fundamentalist countries. So, how you advertise, what people like to see when they advertise, can be different. And then the other big thing you have to deal with market is the middle class. You should have a large or growing middle class. Now, you shouldn't have them. You must have a larger or growing middle class if your product is not a commodity type product, if it's not a required product. You also have to know what in different markets constitutes status symbols. In the US, a lot of times it's big cars or big houses. Those are status symbols to people. Having an airplane. In rural Brazil, it's having a refrigerator. Okay, so you should know what status symbols are and how you can play into that or not, especially when you have a growing middle class. Finally, some other differences you should be aware of: government policies and types. What are tariffs and trade barriers and all of those you need to know, but you also need to know what type of government you're going to be dealing with. In general, a democratic government is best for business. However, some countries have monarchies and they're fine to work with as well. The one you have to be kind of careful of or want to be careful of are the dictatorships. In 1972, Saddam Hussein came in and nationalized the oil industry, even though Exxon and Phillips and those big country companies had gone into the country and developed those. So you have to be very careful. Another thing is intellectual property laws. Not all countries have strong international property laws like we do, and licensing can become an issue. Um, it's something you need to be aware of. And then finally, exchange rates. That's exchange rates deal with how much the dollar is worth. So if we say the dollar is strong, that means that exchange rates in other countries are lower. So instead of $1 equals $1, maybe you have $1 equals 75 cents. And exchange rates can make a huge amount of difference and they can actually give you a competitive advantage. However, as the dollar weakens and the other country's dollar strengthens, you could lose that advantage, and you have to be careful about that. At least be aware of it. Okay, so how do I enter a foreign market? Well, I can just simply export. I can just build my stuff and send it over there. Okay. I can license. And licensing basically allows a foreign company to make the product with some kind of an agreement. Now, the one problem you have to have here is knowing who you're going to send it to. We wanted to get into the Japanese market, and Japan would not allow us to manufacture our TVs and send them to Japan. So we set up licensing agreements with several Japanese companies, and the Japanese, being Japanese, improved on the technology of the licensing that they had. And pretty soon they got better at it than we were, so we don't make TVs in here anymore. So you have to be careful with licensing. Franchising in a foreign country is basically the same as franchising here. Alliances, partners, and joint ventures are all other ways of getting into a foreign market. When you go into a foreign country, it's possible that you will become going into an emerging market. Now, remember, this is not an emerging industry, it's an emerging market. And what that means is that this product isn't sold or is just being sold by a few companies in the market. So, what do you need to do? Well, you can be a low cost leader. You can try to bring the prices down as low as possible to convince people to buy them. You should accommodate local circumstances. We call that think local, act local, or think global, act local. We'll talk about those definitions in a minute. But try to accommodate the local circumstances. Change the market. Um, do something different from what the other people in the industry are doing or in the market are doing. And sometimes you have global giants who are already in there. And so you want to try to use any home field advantages that you have. If you have local contacts or you're using local employees, um, now they're going to obviously do these same kinds of things, but you can use them to your advantage. Apply any expertise you have to cross-border markets. What works in France will probably work in Belgium. And maybe you want to try and create a new business model, maybe even a blue ocean strategy. So, how should you think? Well, think local, act local. Think local, act local is basically where a business has a less centralized governance structure. They tailor their products, advertising to the local market, and they have a tendency to let managers of local plants make more decisions as they pertain to their own local markets and local areas. Think global, act global is the complete opposite. We have a very standardized product, it's the same in every market, and a strong headquarters that makes the decisions. And finally, we have a combination, which is think global, act local. Basically, this is where headquarters runs things, but they have empowered their managers to do some decision making. The products are tailored for the specific market. And that's pretty much the end of chapter 8.